a question box sermon is sort of like the liturgical Russian roulette for ministers. Because you never know what's going to happen. And I have to say that this is the most thoughtful, fascinating group of questions I've ever seen. First up, I have 3 pages of them, and I had to break them into categories because there were so many. So the first category I have theology or great questions. Great questions of truth and existence and how and who we are, like our first hymn. The next category was sort of Dawn's personal journey, like questions about how does an atheist become a minister and why would you do that, and questions about coming to understand a non-binary gender. And then there were some that were sort of Unitarian Universalist specific, questions about where Unitarianism came from and the difference between Unitarians and Universalists, and how did some of our Transcendentalists have an effect on the development of our theology. There are also some history questions in there too. Questions about when did paganism sort of come in and become a part of us, and there was a question about Joseph Campbell, which sent me actually doing research. And then there was what I call the liturgical question, and I got a couple of those, and I think I'm going to start there first. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them because some of them were so big that they require their own sermon, and I'll stockpile those and we'll get to them. So we'll start with the liturgical questions, which is, why do we call this worship? If we are a bunch of whatever, right? We're humanists, we're atheists, we're not really sure, we're Buddhists. So why do we call it worship? And why do we have worship associates? And why do we have something that looks like an altar? And why does a minister wear robes and a stole? And paired with that question was, why do I wear, what's the significance of my collar? And so those are awesome and fairly common questions, especially for Unitarian Universalists who often come from another religious place and are sort of seeking refuge here. And some people have like an allergy to church words, right? They're like, the minister said God. Yeah, well, that happens here. And so to touch on that, I have to go back a little bit into Unitarian Universalist history. Now, when Unitarianism was evolving through the 19th and 20th centuries, the primary sort of school of thought in Unitarianism was developed into what we now call secular humanism. And as such, there was a move away from all of the vestiges of church stuff. Most places stopped doing communion. Most places eventually stopped identifying as Christian altogether. In some places, depending on the architecture of the church, what had been a high pulpit was brought down. Ministers stopped wearing robes. Did I say that already? I might have. And there was a sort of an ethos of the minister is a person, which is true. And the minister is one of us, which today we know is not true. In the same way a therapist is not the same as the client, there's a power differential in that relationship. But that's not what we understood back in the 1950s and 60s. And so And as secular humanists, we weren't really fond of religion. We were very, very rational people, and we sort of got offended at the notion that we might believe in superhuman, all-powerful, omnipotent deities. And we still struggle with that. So, all things in life go in cycles, and so we were very anti-religion for quite a while. We were the anti-religion religion. And as things, as we learned things, as our theology evolved, as what started in the 1950s as very much secular humanism has sort of evolved into a much more spiritual identity, where people, you hear people talk about, I'm spiritual but not religious. And that's a lot of our people. I have friends at my Unitarian Universalist church back in Maine who say that they are religious but not spiritual because they are deeply involved with their church, but they are atheists and do not believe in God or spiritual stuff. So when you take all of that into consideration with the reintroduction of spiritual identity and spiritual practice into our world, we started to reclaim some of the images and the trappings of religiosity. There are those of us also, and this goes to part of why I wear my collar and why I dress like this when I preach, and that is the stuff that comes out of my mouth. Sometimes if I weren't dressed like this, people would not know I'm a minister. They would say, that person, well, yeah. They would more easily believe that I was still a teamster than a minister. And so it's a visual symbol to let people know that not all ministers are the same. It's a visual symbol to let people know that there are ministers who are queer and gender nonconforming. And it's a symbol, especially when I stand up and say that I'm an atheist, that just, you can just see the gears the teeth just shear off. It's so true. Why? 4 years of seminary, I wonder too. But it reminds, first off, one of the things, it reminds me of my job and my role, and that is to minister. And that is, my job is the care of the spiritual well-being and health of this congregation as a whole and the people in it. It also reminds me that my role is as a prophet, as one who speaks truth, and that I'm not able to walk away when I see injustice, that it is my job to confront it. Because there are a lot of times it would be much easier to walk away. So, on the other hand, people who like the stuff that comes out of my mouth, but tend to be anti-church or anti-organized religion, when they find out that I'm a minister, that makes this place a little more accessible to people who thought there wasn't a place for them. Okay? And I think a lot of us have had that experience of when we came to find Unitarian Universalism, it was like, oh, there's a place where I can bring all of me. I don't have to believe things that I don't believe. I don't have to be ashamed of who I am. And so all of that goes into why I wear the collar. There's also science behind some of this stuff. And the science is, okay, we know that for children, doing developmental brain stuff when they're little, children who don't crawl often have a harder time developing language skills. Turns out there's something involved with the way muscles are moved in crawling that helps develop the language centers of the brain. This is just plain old science. And so sometimes if the kid's, first, second grade, what they'll do is they'll develop physical games that'll require the kid to crawl through tunnels and do fun things, but get those muscles moving to stimulate that part of the brain. So science also tells us that ritual, physical ritual, is important to our mental and spiritual health. The act of starting with a chalice lighting, to have something bookending an hour, puts it in a special place in our brains. The act of putting stones in water, that's very much a ritual. The act of lighting the chalice, all of these things, the bell, okay? That's a way to physically embody our spiritual experience here. So some of it is churchy stuff, like all the woo, right? And then some of it is just good science. It's about brains and the marvelous electronic system that is our brain. So that's the liturgical stuff. The UU history stuff, you're going to have to show up to the class. We've got a two-part UU history class beginning next week. It'll be next week and the week after, so February 25th and March 3rd, it'll be after church. You don't want to miss it. Dawn's personal journey. I'm not going to say too much about that, but I will say that when I entered seminary, I haven't always been an atheist. I grew up Irish Catholic. I did the whole First Communion thing with my little pink plastic rosary beads. Frilly white dress, white patent leather shoes, the whole... Go ahead, I'll let you spend a minute there. Go ahead. I was confirmed at St. Augustine's. You know how I feel about Augustine. In Augusta, Maine. Yep. And I very much believed in the notion of a Trinity, the notion of a death and resurrection of Jesus, the notion of redemption, the notion of heaven and hell, and that you got sorted. In 12-step recovery work, I tended to let go of some of the religious stuff and focus on the relationship between me and my higher power. And then years later, when I came out, the church and I abandoned one another at about the same time. I was not welcome there, and the things they were saying were not welcome in my heart. And then I went, for a while, I found Unitarian Universalism, and I was sort of a hot mess when I got here. But I found a place that said that all people have worth and dignity. And that's what I clung to. And I don't know that I had a belief in God necessarily. I grew to sort of understand holiness as mystery, as natural wonder. For a while I lived in Bar Harbor, Maine, and when you live in Bar Harbor, you're very connected to the ocean. You know when the tides are, because there are roads that sometimes if there's a storm, you just can't come through at high tide, because the water blows over. So I understood a higher power as that natural thing, right? The rules of the universe, the science of nature. Like the tide goes out and it comes back. And it does that. And my body is 90% water. My body has the exact same salinity level as the ocean. And so I know the moon affects the ocean. It seems extremely arrogant for me to think it doesn't affect me. And so my spirituality grew to a place where I was more attuned to the natural world around me. And then I went to seminary. And what happens in seminary is a lot of people come in very, very zealous and enthusiastic in their religion. And that gets sort of disassembled in their first year. But I came in as an angry, wounded ex-Catholic who was very upset to learn that I had to take 6 credit hours of scripture. I was unaware of how many translations there were of the Bible and what the difference was. I also didn't know that there wasn't a disciple named Luke, so it was a rough start for me. And so in the course of seminary, I developed to a place where I got the concept of a loving God. Whatever it is that created this marvelous universe, whether it was the Big Bang or whatever, there was beauty and wonder in that creation. And whether it was science or some omnipotent Zeus Santa-looking guy, stirring things, it didn't really matter because it was amazing. And then I got to a place where I don't know how to describe it. I'm really comfortable with the notion of that there maybe isn't a God. I'm okay if other people have one. I'm just not convinced that there is one. And the wonderful thing about Unitarian Universalism is that we are inherently religiously pluralistic. And so that what I believe and what you believe do not have to agree for us both to be here. And so and one of the questions on the theology part was, what's the difference between atheist and agnostic? And I talked with Michael about this before the service, and we used to understand that it was sort of like two sides of a coin. Like the atheist is convinced and has proof that there is no God. And the agnostic says, there might be one, but I haven't seen any proof of it, so I don't know. And so now that's more of a continuum, okay? And I tend to be on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is, there is absolutely no God, we know that for sure is science. And 1 is, there is God, and God has personally touched my life. I'm somewhere in the 8 range, maybe, okay? There might be. I'd be great, awesome if there is. Hurrah, I hope you're cool with what I've been doing. But I'm not, I don't have a belief in an intercessionary God. The God of my childhood, or like St. Anthony, where my grandmother couldn't find her glasses. You guys are there are people who remember St. Anthony, right? Yep. Or my aunt would she still does. She'll say a quick prayer to, I don't remember which saint, but for a parking place in Boston. And there are multiple saints for parking spaces in Boston. So that's where, how I got to this odd place where I'm the minister who's the atheist. All right, I'm not going to do the history. You have to come to the class. I did the liturgy. The theology questions, I want to share these with you because they are just so magnificent. How does one know what is true? And I'm really glad I asked you to explain some on those sheets, because this was a fascinating reason for why this person wanted to know. And, we have conflicting ideas based on our upbringing and current ideologies and perspectives on history, society, and politics. seems like we have opinions, but how do we know? Like, how do we know what's real, what's true, for sure? Or is it all just sort of filtered through our own lenses of our own experience? So when I do my DMin, thank you very much for my dissertation, that's going to be one that takes its own sermon. You know, that's a really big, amazing question. There's another one that wants the concept of God addressed within the idea of atheism, and are the two mutually exclusive? And I think that depends on where you are in that continuum. You know, if you're a 10, then they sort of are mutually exclusive. But if you're anything from like a 9.9 down, then there's room for a God, however someone might define it. Now, it might be the bearded white, Jesus' dad kind of God. Or it might be nature, or it might be any of the Norse gods. But there's room. There's room. Like I said, for me, my understanding of God is that it's this sort of awesome science of nature. Like, I don't believe in an intercessionary God, but I believe that the earth will right itself. And some of that's science, and some of that is stuff I don't understand. And I'm okay with the not understanding. Would you please speak about the worth and dignity of all people? Because this bit of common sense feels more and more uncommon. And that is true. And that is beautiful. And that goes to our universalist roots. And our universalist roots were based in the working class Baptist theology, the agricultural world of the 18th century. And a people who understood what it was to really need somebody to be merciful. To really need a God that would love them no matter what, and forgive them no matter what. Unitarians understood that divinity was within us, okay, and being made in God's image, all things, like everything was possible. Like, there was just so much possible. The possibilities, the potential for the human condition and the human spirit and the human mind was just limitless. And the universalists didn't have that feeling about themselves. They were a more humble folk who knew that maybe they were going to need somebody to forgive them at some point and wipe off a debt that they owed. And so they developed this theology of a loving God that loved us all, no matter what. And we all have worth and dignity. And sometimes we forget that, and sometimes we look at... I think one of the reasons that humans invented hell, and we did. It's not technically scriptural, and we can go into that another time. But it was, I really think part of the reason why we did that was so that we could sort of look over the wall and see who didn't make it. Right? Because we all are pretty sure that we're going to be in heaven, and we want to sort of look over and be like, I figured that. I warned them. Right? I think that's part of human nature as well, is that we have this sort of striation in our life, this pecking order, you know, and the notion of the inherent worth and dignity of all people sort of eliminates that who's higher and who's lower. And that's a challenge. And that goes to one of the other questions that just, I remember I opened the papers and I was just, why is it so hard to show love? And the reason for the question was, there's not enough of it. That's a sermon. You're going to have to wait on that one. That was, wow, that was beautiful. Yeah, and that's going to take its own sermon. That's not something I can do justice in a couple of minutes right now, you know. Difference between atheist and agnostic we talked about. This one I loved. This one was written in a child's penmanship. How was the sun made? Which is a deep theological question. It goes to astrophysics. It goes to the notion of creation. It goes to wonder. Oh, and the reason? Because I want to know. And that, my friends, is the best reason to ask a question. Because I want to know. Because that is inherent curiosity. What do I want to know? And what does a minister have to say about how the sun is made? You know, there are 2 creation stories in Genesis. There are. You got to look them up. It's pretty amazing. And then we have the Big Bang, which I understand, if I were trying to explain this to a small child, it would be like fireworks. Something explodes, and instead of fizzling out, it just keeps going. Right? Like, that's how the universe began. But that's as good as I've got. I mean, after that, we're like, let's color or something. Because that's, like, wow. Like, again, that's one of those ones that will stay with me and cause me to think for a while. Another question, what's the distinction between faith and belief? And if there is a distinction, how do you make that and why? And I think that might get worked into the how do we know the truth sermon. Those two might get addressed in the same place. Why is it so hard to show love? How is the sun made? Now this is part of the reason why I don't do extemporaneous preaching, because I get to this point and I'm like, okay, I'm done. How do I wrap this up? So what I'll say now this morning is, I'm going to ask you to join me in a couple of breaths. If you want to get comfortable, take a few breaths. Breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. One more. Breathe in and out. And I want to thank you for asking really good questions and for being naturally curious and for reminding me why I'm a minister. Amen.